So good morning, everybody. And before we start, what I'd like to do is pay my respects and acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. For anyone who's been on an Australian tour before, you'd be familiar with giving acknowledgement to country, and it's something that is carried out at most events and occasions to acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land. If you were of Indigenous heritage, you might give a welcome to country, which is a little different, and it could involve dancing and singing and even a smoking ceremony. So we're approaching Homebush Bay now at this point. When we look up to the left here, we can see there's a bus crossing a bridge. That's Bennelong Bridge. And just beyond that point is the Parramatta River, which flows into Sydney Harbour, where roughly 10 miles or 16 kilometres to the right is the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Over here on our left, we have Wentworth Point, which is quite nice, low-rise, medium-density housing, less than 20 years old. And the bridge connects us to the suburb of Rhodes, which is similarly a recently newly developed area. And I'll talk about that building over there with the weird structure on top of it in a moment. All right, so here are the stars of the show, and one of the main reasons why we're here today. These are the first two shipwrecks that we've coming across. On the left, we have the SS Mortlake Bank, and on the right is the SS Airfield. And it's the one you probably may have seen in any of those lists going around social media where they have lists of photos of abandoned places. They were both steam colliers and they were scuttled here in the 60s. So I'm going to turn around to the right and we'll walk slowly towards Sydney Olympic Park, in actual fact. This whole area was redeveloped in the late 1990s to make way for the Sydney Olympics, and many of the venues lie to the south of here in Sydney Olympic Park. The area before the redevelopment was largely heavy industrial, so chemical companies, paint factories. There was even an abattoir and tannery in the area, so you can imagine what the quality of the land was like, let alone the water. In fact, the water was considered dead. Now it's all coming back, but fishing is still not advised. In fact, I think it's illegal. So we're walking along a path here alongside one of the apartment blocks, and we're going to head over this cute little bridge. If I spot anything, wildlife or plants that I think you might not be familiar with, I'll try and point it out as well. Okay, so over here we can see we're getting closer to the two shipwrecks. And before we cross over the little bridge, I'm going to point out we're going to have a sneaky peek at the apartments on the right because they're in a rather special location. It's actually a private property that we're walking through, but it's permitted because it's on the waterfront. So imagine, guys, living here. How special do you think this would be? We have the apartments with their own little private man-made beach. Again, the apartments are fairly low rise. We've only got, 7 or 8 floors. Multi-level pools. We're not spying on anybody here because of the weather, so that's an upside to a rainy day. And they have this magnificent view. Oh, look, the rowers are out. Looks like they're about to do a bit of training. So as we approach the airfield, we're actually approaching the favourite photography point where most of the photos are taken that you might come across. It's a pity it's a bit dull, but you can see that the hulk is being taken over by mangrove trees. Its inhabitants now are mainly birds, lots of seagulls that nest in there. And in the background, that building over there with the structure on top that's called Road Central. The structure on the top of the building is called a heliostat, and apparently what its purpose is to reflect sunlight onto the precinct below, so that an area that might otherwise be in perpetual shade from the tall buildings has some light cast down upon it. There's an array of mirrors apparently that are motorised and track with the sun. It's one of only 2 residential buildings with a heliostat, and the other one is also in Sydney. So the other building, called Central Park, is located quite close to Central Station. So there you have the SS airfield. And coming up behind it on its right, we might see, just poking around behind it, is a tiny glimpse of the other ship, the SS Mortlake Bank. Okay, we're moving on into a grove of mangroves. Normally, you'd be able to see the mud flats underneath the mangrove trees. We get a little glimpse of some over here on the right. Once upon a time, an area like this would have been cut down so that the apartments would have their uninterrupted water views. Now we're a little bit smarter and we know the value of mangrove swamps to the health of the waterways. It's a nursery, if you like, for water and aquatic animals, and it also helps to clean the waterways. The story on the wreck, they were both steam colliers, and they were both built in the UK. They were brought out to Australia in around about the 1930s, I believe, and used to ship coal between Newcastle and Sydney. So they were part of a flotilla known as the 60 Milers, which is the distance between Newcastle Harbour and Sydney Harbour. And then in the 1960s, they were scuttled. The airfield, the one that's the photogenic one, was actually also used during World War II to get supplies to the Americans stationed somewhere in the Coral Sea, I understand. But I'm happy to be corrected on that fact. So this area, as I also already mentioned, wasn't exactly a pristine location back in the late 60s. Permission was given to scuttle the ships. There's 4 or 5 vessels wrecked in Homebush Bay in total, and we are planning to see 4 of them today. There's also some barges scuttled here as well. So at this point here, we are at the mouth of Haslam's Creek, which is one of 2 tributaries that flows into Homebush Bay. And the other one, Powell's Creek, is just over here beyond that point over there. All right, so we're going to walk towards this bridge. Again, I'm trying to move slowly. All right, so we're walking towards the bridge that crosses Haslam's Creek, and I need to cross the road to cross the bridge because there's no footpath on this side of the road. It's quite a narrow bridge. So for anyone who lives in a country where you drive on the right, please don't be alarmed when I cross the road. The traffic here will be driving on the left, and so it will be coming from my right when I cross the road. I tell you what, I'm wearing a raincoat and it is so hot. It's so humid. I feel like I'm in Singapore. So this is where we're going to cross the road. There's no crossing. I just have to be very careful. We won't cross in front of this bus. Let's see what the traffic's like to the right. I could have to stand here a while. All right, we've got a break coming up on the right. Let's see what the left looks like. All right, you ready, guys? We're going to cross the road. Let's go. Hey ho. Okay, we're safe. All right, so I'm going to take a quick look up at Haslam's Creek. You can see that the tide is very full on that contraption that crosses the creek, and I don't know what that is. I often see cormorants sitting there drying their wings after going for a bit of a dive. And up here on the left is a man-made hill. The reason that they made a hill was that all that toxic soil from the area was pushed into one place and then capped with concrete. We have 3 of those hills in Sydney Olympic Park. There's a path that spirals up to the top, and hopefully on another tour I might try to incorporate that. My husband and I have e-bikes. That's a great way to get to the top. As we walk along this road here, which is called Bennelong Parkway, you can see quite a few of these trees, which are called paperbark trees. And anyone who remembers Matt's tours would remember paperbark trees. He was really good at explaining how the Indigenous peoples would have used paperbark, including for absorbent lining material in diapers, nappies, and also for wrapping food in for cooking, such as fish. At Bennelong, who the bridge was named after, Bennelong Bridge and Bennelong Parkway. Okay, just before we cross back over the road, here's the other view of, it's called the Bay Marker. And we may also just have a quick look at this map here so I can show you where we are and orientate you a little. Up the top here, it shows Parramatta River, and it leads to Sydney Harbour in this direction. And this is Homebush Bay here. Bennelong Bridge is that one. Someone looks like they put a little bit of sticky tape over the map just to show that there's a bridge there. And we started about here, and we've been walking around. The shipwrecks are here. We're going to walk around the wetlands. And if we get a chance, we'll duck into the wetlands and see if there are any water birds there today. So we mentioned Bennelong Bridge and the road, Bennelong Parkway, which were both named after Bennelong, who was a Wongal man. All right, we're going to do this road crossing thing again. Here we go. Let's go. All right, so now at this point, we're about to enter Sydney Olympic Park. And the northernmost part of Sydney Olympic Park has been largely naturalised. So returned to natural vegetation. And as you saw on the map there, there's the large wetlands area for the migratory birds. Apart from the vegetation, there's not really a lot to see along this section. So I'll continue talking about Bennelong, who was a Wongal man. And the Wongal people were probably the first that Captain Arthur Phillip, who later became Governor Phillip when he established the colony, they would have been the first people that he and his people encountered on landing in Sydney Cove. Bennelong was actually captured by Phillip's soldiers. Phillip was under orders from the king at the time to establish relationships with whichever Indigenous peoples he encountered. Bennelong ended up being... Oh, there's a bike coming, and I'm wandering into the middle of the path. Bennelong ended up being quite useful to Captain Phillip and was a useful intermediary between the original inhabitants and the new arrivals. They took him back to England. They showed him around, paraded him around, and then brought him back here. And as a token of Philip's gratitude, he actually built a hut for him in Sydney Harbour on the site known as Bennelong Point. Now, of course, there's a far more substantial house occupying Bennelong Point. The Sydney Opera House now occupies where Bennelong's hut used to be on Bennelong Point. So we're walking out along this path, and if I am quiet for a moment, we might hear more birds and cicadas. Or my feet crunching on the gravel. Okay, so this little point here is called Shipwreck Lookout. I've tried to use those binoculars there, and I've never been able to make it work. Over here on the left is the other side of the two shipwrecks we saw earlier. So on the left, of course, is the airfield, and on the right, which looks like it's more out in the middle of the bay from this vantage point, is the Mortlake Bank. And you can see there's a lot more seagulls on the Mortlake Bank. It just must be more appealing for some reason to the birds. There are fish jumping over on my right. I doubt you're going to catch them, but you might be able to see the ripples. Yeah, there was another one right over there. I just saw another fish jump. So there's obviously fish in this area, which is really good. Very promising. But you're still not allowed to fish here because of the lingering toxicity from all the paint chemicals. There's Road Central again, another view of Road Central. I want to get the perfect angle because in the front here we have the remnants of a couple of old barges. I just heard another fish jump. Can you see the bird out on the end of the barge? I think it's an egret. It's another popular spot for the cormorants to stand and dry their wings. Oh, he looks like he spotted something. Look at the angle he's holding his neck at. Okay, I'm not going to wait. I've been around too many fishermen in my life. I'm not going to wait around for you to get a good catch. Okay, we'll head back this way now. Okay, so back along the path here, we're going to see one more wreck on this path. And it's muddy and slippery, and I'm watching where I'm walking so that you don't all of a sudden see sky through the camera. Okay, so heading back out towards IKEA. There's a little path here that heads out to a kind of a contemplation seat, I'd like to think of it. It's literally, oh, that was a duck. And he flew away. So right over here, and I've got to be really careful because I'm leaning out over water. There's another shipwreck just over there, tucked into the mangroves. I don't know the name of this one. I've searched. What I can tell you is that the way that this one is labelled on Google Maps is incorrect. It's identified as the SS Heroic, but we're going to go and see where the Heroic is in a moment. Just before we leave this path, I'd like to show you this plant here is what's called warrigal greens, and it substitutes well for spinach. It's also called New Zealand spinach. So I have foraged warrigal greens a couple of times. It tastes fine in a spanakopita. Okay, and this is the bow. Oh, no, sorry. Got that wrong. This is the stern, rather, of that boat we saw a moment ago. But I'm going to lean out over the water again and see if we can see into the bow of this vessel. Oh, wrong way. There we go. For anyone who's interested in rusting hulks, that might make a good postcard. Moving on. We're going to walk around now towards the final shipwreck. And again, it's a path with just vegetation on either side. So I'm going to tell you another story about another significant resident or person who was significant to this area. And we already mentioned Wentworth Point. So Wentworth Point was named after Darcy Wentworth. Can you hear the cicadas? And I can hear crows and I can hear currawongs. Okay, so Darcy Wentworth, he arrived on the Second Fleet. The Second Fleet was the notorious. It was notorious for losing a quarter of its 1,000 convicts on the voyage on the way over here. So it was a rather disastrous journey. Something like 250 people were killed on the way over. And then when they got here, the colony was starving. They'd been waiting on supplies to arrive with the Second Fleet. And much of the supplies had gone down. And the convicts arrived. The convicts that did arrived with various diseases, smallpox, of course. So not only was there a large casualty during the voyage, but a lot of them died once they arrived as well. We did things well back in those days, didn't we? Darcy Wentworth was on that voyage. He comes from, not nobility, landed gentry. He's originally Irish. No, well, probably... From my looking into it, he wasn't originally Irish. His family was originally, centuries back, English. They were one of the ones that went to Ireland as landed gentry and had big houses in Ireland. So the Wentworth was quite a significant name in landed gentry circles. Anyway, Darcy was training to be a doctor in London, and he was used to a certain lifestyle, and he was earning very little in training to be a doctor. But Darcy had other skills. He and some of his friends were particularly good at playing cards and realised that this could be a way to supplement their meagre income. So they would frequent inns and gaming houses where the wealthy members of society would hang out. And they would usually win. But of course, playing cards is illegal. And many of the people that they would win against would feel no obligation to pay up. So Darcy and his friends decided that they could get them dues back by holding up the carriages as they left the gaming establishments. He was actually charged 3 or 4 times, arrested and charged. He also got off 3 or 4 times because obviously if you're a pillar of society, you don't want your name associated with playing illegal games. So the charges didn't really hold up in court. He left London in a bit of a hurry. He convinced the magistrate that he had somewhere to go, being New South Wales. And he was the first fare-paying passenger to arrive in the new colony. I'm just going to look over to the left here. You might be able to see the bow of the SS Karanji. This is the hardest wreck to see because we've got all the mangroves in the foreground, so it's really quite difficult to see the HMAS Karanji. But it was a boom vessel, which meant that it laid the boom lines for Darwin when the Japanese were invading Darwin in the Second World War. When the tide's out, it is possible to walk out along the mudflats a little bit closer. What are boom lines? Okay, so it's a line that goes across the harbour that has kind of like 44-gallon drums attached. that contain explosives, so that invading ships, I'm bending right down low to try and get the best view I can of this ship. It's pretty tricky. So, yes, they would lay these boom lines across the harbour. And if I do this tour again on a day when the tide is out, I might be able to get out to about that tree in the middle there to enable us to get a little bit closer to this wreck. My camera's going all over the place. I think it's trying to find a focus point. Down. Yeah, I'm not going to get any better than that. That's the best I can do. But if you remember, I mentioned the SS Heroic. If you look on Google Maps and get the view looking down with the satellite image rather than the map image, you can see there are actually two ships that lie side by side at this point. The second one's lying behind the first one. All right, so we're finished with shipwrecks. We've seen them all. But what we have over the other side here is a whole gaggle of pelicans. They must be really loving the wet weather. And if I can find a good spot, okay, I think that's about the best I'm going to get of pelicans. Okay, so there's our pelicans, and we're going to go around to the bird hide around the other side. We're at 39 minutes. I've got a few minutes left just to quickly finish off the story of Darcy. So we mentioned that he was arrested and charged. He managed to get himself a ship out of town. What he didn't manage to do was take his young bride with him. A few weeks before he joined the Neptune in Portsmouth, he'd actually travelled to Gretna Green with a young girl. So if anyone doesn't know what Gretna Green is, it's the very first place outside of England where you can get a marriage ceremony performed under Scottish law, which is far more relaxed, or was at the time, than English law. That's the bird hide over there. We're just going to go over there and see if we can sit quietly for a few minutes and see if there are any birds that turn up while we're sitting there. He married a 15-year-old girl by the name of Jane. Now, these aren't facts that you will find in many places if you go looking for the history of Darcy Wentworth. You'll find some oblique references to his private life, but it was a book that I discovered called Darcy and Jane, written by Wal Walker, who is a familial descendant of the Wentworths. He has researched a lot of the correspondence, the letters and records from the shipping of the time and court records and all sorts of places. He's quite thorough. All of his writing has been sourced. So the girl that he married was heartbroken when she couldn't go to Australia with Darcy. Her family wouldn't allow it. They didn't sanction the marriage. So she poured her heartbreak into her writing. Her writing became well-known novels, and she would name people, characters in her books after people who were important in her life. One of those people, of course, was Darcy. So I'm wondering if anyone has figured out who the Darcy character is, which book I might be referring to, and who the author is. That's right, Lorraine. Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, as in Mr. Darcy. Absolutely correct. So that's the scandal. He spent much of his life trying to return to England. So he spent 6 years in Norfolk Island as a surgeon. His first son was conceived to a convict woman on the journey out here. Her name was Catherine Crowley. And I'm just going to sit here for a few minutes while I finish telling you about Mr. Darcy Wentworth. And so William Wentworth was Darcy's eldest son, conceived on the Neptune to a convict woman by the name of Catherine Crowley. William Wentworth went on to become one of the three explorers, as in Blaxland, Wentworth and Lawson, who found a way across the Blue Mountains. Catherine stayed on to mother two more of his children, but they never married. Darcy always wanted to return to England, never made it there. And Catherine died at a young age of a redback spider bite. Jane Austen died young herself. Her family denied her story. Maybe much of that was choice. So yes, that's the real famous Wentworth, William Wentworth, who traversed the Blue Mountains. So this is the wetlands. There's those pelicans. I know you can't see them very well because I can't zoom in. But do you mind if I just remain quiet for a moment so that you can enjoy the view?